Brilliant law professor and father of two, Dan Markel, died on July 19th of 2014. Just 41 years old, Dan succumbed to injuries he received the day before when a hired hitman entered his garage and cornered him in his car. Another hitman was waiting in the getaway car in Dan's driveway. So far, 4 people have been convicted in connection with the 2014 Red Rum. They include the 2 hired thugs, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, Garcia's baby mama, Catherine McBanoa, who was also Charlie Adelson's girlfriend at one point, and Dan Markel's brother-in-law, Charlie Adelson. In addition, Charlie's mother, Donna, who would have been Dan's mother-in-law, is currently in jail in Florida awaiting her trial. Donna was arrested at the Miami International Airport with a one-way ticket to Vietnam in hand. And she was charged with first-degree red rum, conspiracy to commit first-degree red rum, and solicitation of, you guessed it, red rum. Her trial is supposed to take place this year, 2025. What's most ironic about all of this is that the person who had the greatest motive for wanting Dan Markel dead was his ex-wife, Wendi Adelson. That would be Charlie's sister and Donna Adelson's daughter. Wendi did not want to continue living in Tallahassee, Florida, where Dan was a tenured law professor at Florida State University, or FSU. Because Wendi and Dan shared custody of their 2 young sons, and Dan's career was in Tallahassee, Wendi was ordered by the court during their divorce to remain in Tallahassee. And she would have had to remain there until her sons reached the age of 18. Wendi's parents, Donna and Harvey Adelson, and her favorite brother, Charlie, all lived in Miami. That's a 7 to 8 hour drive by car from Tallahassee. Now, Wendi and her mother, Donna, were pretty much obsessed with finding a way to get Wendi and her 2 sons to South Florida full time. At the same time, Dan Markel was adamant that he would never agree to have his boys live full-time in Miami. Again, the irony in this most tragic story is that Wendi, the person in the Adelson family with the most to gain from Dan Markel's death, has not yet been charged in connection with his red rum. Now, many people who followed the case for years believe Wendi, her brother, and maybe her mother too, depending on how her trial goes, should spend the rest of her life in jail. The problem, per legal experts, is that there may not be enough evidence to tie Wendi to the crime. She, so far, has avoided charges and continues to maintain her innocence. But if her mother, Donna, is found guilty, it may pave the way for Wendi to be charged as well. Hi, I'm T, and this is Bed Crime Stories podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the work I do, please consider a donation. You can find that information on my YouTube channel, Bed Crime Stories. Today, I'm going to examine the circumstantial evidence that may just get Wendi Adelson charged in connection with Dan Markel's death. And law enforcement needs to move quickly because apparently Wendi has moved from Miami to Austin, Texas, which isn't too far from the border into Mexico. If her mother, Donna, would try to flee to Vietnam, then there's a possibility that Wendi might do the same thing. Nobody wants to spend their life in prison. But let me stress that Wendi Adelson has not been charged with any crimes, and thus she's considered innocent at this point in the eyes of the law. So join me now as I review both the big pieces of the puzzle and the little ones that would seem to indicate Wendi Adelson's involvement, allegedly, in her ex-husband's red rum. And let me give a shout out to the YouTube channel known as Carl Steinbeck. Steinbeck is a lawyer, so he likely knows how to build a case. We'll start with the days prior to the crime to see if Wendi's behavior indicates in any way foreknowledge of Dan Markel's planned unaliving. Before the red rum, Dan Markel alleged in court filings that Wendi had failed to disclose marital assets during their divorce. Wendi also failed to return the diamond ring with which Dan proposed to her. The ring was a cherished Markel family heirloom. It had actually survived the Holocaust, meaning family members had managed to get it out of Nazi Germany. Thus, it was a very important memento, and Wendi never really even wore it as her wedding ring. Now, at this time, Wendi was likely dreading the upcoming court hearing because it very well could have destroyed her entire law career. Lawyers swear an oath not to lie, not to hide assets, etc. The court filing would have also significantly altered Donna and Harvey Adelson's visitation rights with Dan and Wendi's two young sons. Dan actually accused Donna Adelson of trying to alienate his young sons by badmouthing him in front of the children. Moving forward, Dan wanted Donna to be supervised when visiting with his kids. As you can imagine, this did not go over well with Donna Adelson. By all accounts, she was livid to the point of allegedly masterminding the evil plot against Dan Markel. So both Donna and Wendi were off the charts angry at Dan Markel, and both likely felt that they could not allow Dan to win in court. The stakes were simply too high, allegedly. Wendi's motion to move to South Florida with her sons and to try and gain sole custody or full-time custody of the boys was pretty much a wasted effort. And that's because joint custody between Dan and Wendi had already been established in 2013. Thus, her post-divorce filing was pretty much viewed as frivolous. And it was pretty clear to everyone that Wendi had not behaved well before she filed for a divorce. And that's because in 2012, she emptied her joint savings deposit box, the one that she shared with Dan. She also made sure to take a pre-divorce parenting course that was required before she even asked Dan for a divorce. By doing all of this, Wendi demonstrated how calculating she could be. Basically, Wendi stole $500,000 in assets, allegedly. She also held on tight to the family heirloom ring, despite agreeing to return it to Dan. And Dan was about to file a fraud motion against Wendi that could have gotten her disbarred and fired. Again, the stakes were really high for Wendi Adelson. This legal bomb would have imploded Wendi's career if Dan would have won. Wendi also changed her Facebook profile photo the day before the crime. She suddenly changed her image from a single mother of two to a single professional lawyer. Some say the photo was even photoshopped by her father, Harvey Adelson. Now, in June of 2014, the year of the crime, Wendi, according to her then-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse, would start crying for no reason, and she wouldn't explain her emotions to him. Wendi's crying may have been about the plot to doing Dan Markel. Maybe she was having second thoughts. Maybe she felt that she was backed into a corner to save her career and that she would have to do something really awful. Maybe she saw it as necessary because it was the only thing that was going to save her law career. Of course, this is all circumstantial evidence, but if you have enough of it, it can convince jurors of someone's guilt. By the way, the hit on Dan Markel was originally set to take place in June. The two hired thugs had driven to Tallahassee, but they couldn't find Dan Markel. So maybe Wendi was afraid it's not easy to actually be involved in another person's red rum. Wendi also allegedly told Jeff Lacasse that she felt stuck in Tallahassee and that the only way out of there was if something were to happen to Dan Markel. So all of these things begin to put pieces of the puzzle together. These are all potential indicators of Wendi's knowledge of the crime before it went down. Allegedly. Remember, she has not been charged with any crime. We also know that Wendi was envious of Dan's success. She resented the fact that he had a law degree from Harvard. We know this because Dan told his friends not to mention Harvard in Wendi's presence. Most spouses would be proud of their partner's success, but for Wendi, it seemed to be more of a rivalry. During a court hearing when Wendi was seeking full-time custody of her and Dan's sons, and also permission to move to South Florida, she accused Dan of creating a hostile work environment for her at FSU. Remember, Wendi worked there as well. However, she worked in a different building from Dan, but she still felt that Dan was somehow poisoning her reputation. After Dan died, Wendi was able to instantly escape what she claimed was a hostile work environment in Tallahassee. She was no longer bound by the court to remain there because of her shared custody of their sons. So timeline-wise, Dan Markel sustained his injury on a Friday. He died the next day on Saturday. He was memorialized on Sunday, and by Monday, Wendi had already moved from Tallahassee with her two now fatherless sons to Miami. Her parents had been in Tallahassee to help her fill the vehicles with all of her belongings. Now, when Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, first arrived in Tallahassee after getting word of Dan's fatal injuries, they went to Wendi's house to see the children, and they were struck by how few belongings of the boys were there. Ruth realized later, after she found out that Wendi moved back to Miami right after Dan's service, that Wendi must have already been packed for the move to Miami before Dan had even died. This would obviously seem to indicate that Wendi had foreknowledge of the crime. Of course, this is speculation, but being able to move so quickly to Miami that same weekend and never need to have to return to Tallahassee is an indicator that Wendi may have known about the two hired thugs. Another indicator is how aggressively she fought for sole custody of her kids and to be given permission by the court to relocate to South Florida. Those are facts. She fought hard for those things while Dan was still alive. But years later, after the Red Rum, and after the hitman had been arrested and charged and tried, when Wendi was called to the stand to testify in court, she said that she was, quote, relieved with the judge in her divorce proceedings denying her permission to relocate to Miami, which meant that she would need to spend the next 15 years in Tallahassee until the boys were 18. There's no way Wendi was relieved when the judge said no to her. How convenient to later say that she was relieved. I'm calling BS. Wendi and her mother Donna continued to strategize actions that would make it possible for Wendi to not only move to Miami, but also to have her boys with her there full time. Moving on to the next indicator, when Wendi was interviewed by the police on the day Dan was attacked, she told law enforcement that her brother, Charlie Adelson, had once joked that he looked into hiring a hitman to do away with Dan Markel as a divorce present. But he ultimately concluded that it would be cheaper to buy Wendi a TV. Wendi shared Charlie's so-called joke about the hitman to no less than 3 different people. She told 1, the TV repairman who just happened to be fixing her TV on the morning Dan was injured. 2, she also told her boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse. And 3, she told the police who were interviewing her. What's also fascinating about Wendi sharing Charlie's joke with the police is that she was essentially throwing her brother under the bus. This was her way, allegedly, of giving the police Charlie's name as a potential suspect. Of course, Wendi went on to tell the officer that she didn't believe Charlie would ever do this, but of course the damage was done. Charlie was now on the cops' radar. So Wendi didn't appear to have a problem implicating her brother Charlie. She didn't seem to care about the police possibly prosecuting Charlie down the road. So what does this indicate about Wendi? Well, it could say that she's okay with other people doing her dirty work. It could also say she's okay throwing those people who allegedly helped her under the bus. And it sort of indicates that she's a person who only cares about herself. Moving on to the next indicator, Wendi told her and Dan's friend, Tamara Demko. However, when Demko asked Wendi about her boyfriend, on the day after the crime, Wendi said that there was no boyfriend. When Wendi told Jeff Lacasse about Charlie, saying he thought about hiring a hitman, she never said to Jeff anything like, I told Charlie that was a terrible idea, or I made it clear to Charlie that he should not do such a thing. And Jeff Lacasse found this very alarming. Here's yet another indicator. When Wendi finally made it obvious to Dan Markel that she was going to divorce him, she did it in a particularly cruel way. While Dan was in New York City giving a lecture, Wendi and her parents moved all of her things, all of the boys' clothing they could still wear, and most of her and Dan's shared furniture out of the marital home. She also grabbed their sons. Then she calls Dan in New York to tell him she's divorcing him. Dan, who was shocked, canceled his lecture and headed straight home in hopes of saving his marriage. But when he opened the front door to the home, he immediately knew that Wendi and his sons were gone. Wendi also refused to tell him where she and their boys were. For 2 weeks, Dan had no clue where his little boys were. All of this illustrates Wendi's cold, calculating, and secretive nature. There's no kindness or compassion when a spouse pulls this type of vanishing act. It's actually very shocking to the other spouse, and it's not the honest way to handle a divorce from the father of your children. It would also violate the custody agreement, I think, to take the children to an undisclosed location for any amount of time. Another indicator that Wendi might have been in on the plot to unalive Dan Markel is how she and her mother fought against Dan's wishes to raise his sons in a strict Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. Getting rid of Dan would mean that Wendi no longer had a fight with him over serving their kids prohibited foods like bacon and pizza, pepperoni pizza, or ham pizza. This food issue went all the way back to Wendi and Dan's wedding. Dan had insisted at that time that only kosher foods be served at the wedding, and Donna and Wendi agreed. However, during the reception, it quickly became clear that the food was not kosher. And this was embarrassing for Dan because he had to go all around to his Orthodox friends to tell them not to eat any of the food. And the rabbi who performed the ceremony was so disgusted by this that he left. That should have been a huge red flag for Dan, but of course he was now married to Wendi, and he also adored her. Here's another indicator. After a yoga class early on the week of Dan's death, Wendi, who met up with her boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse there, she basically blew Jeff off and wasn't very warm and fuzzy. As Wendi and Jeff were walking to their separate vehicles, Wendi turned around and asked Jeff if he was going to be in Tallahassee on Friday. She wanted to know if he was going to be leaving town on Friday. Jeff thought this was very odd, given that Wendi had been giving him the vibe that she no longer wanted to date him or hang out with him. He thought they were broken up. Hours later, Wendi emailed Jeff and told him not to contact her. She said she wanted no contact. Wendi's behavior here becomes suspicious later, after Dan was attacked, when Wendi is being interviewed by the police. When they asked Wendi who might want to harm Dan, a friend of Wendi, whom Wendi had called down to the police station to comfort her, brought up Jeff Lacasse's name. And she did this because Wendi had just told her that Jeff was angry at Dan Markel for causing Wendi stress and for accusing her of hiding marital assets during the divorce. So naturally, the cops bring Jeff Lacasse down to the station for an interview. Now, had Jeff left for his trip on Friday, the same day Dan Markel was injured, it would have looked very sus. Thankfully, Jeff actually left town on Thursday, and he was clearly out of town when the crime occurred, and he had the receipts to prove it. Jeff believes, as many others do, that Wendi was trying to pin Dan's red rum on him. Jeff also let the cops know about Wendi telling him a week before Dan's death that her brother had looked into hiring a hitman the summer before in 2023, and that he had explored all options. If Wendi was against the hitman idea, why did she happen to mention it again to Jeff Lacasse a week before the crime? When Wendi mentioned this to Jeff, she did not say again, "Charlie's crazy," or "I told Charlie absolutely not." No, she said nothing to that effect, and it kind of freaked Jeff out. So Wendi may have been thinking that if Jeff doesn't become a suspect in Dan's death, then maybe her brother Charlie will. And if Charlie is considered a suspect, which is what later happened, then when Jeff inevitably brings up what Wendi told him about Charlie wanting to hire a hitman, then Jeff would be providing circumstantial evidence that Charlie was likely behind the crime. You see what I mean? Again, if this is true, it shows how incredibly conniving Wendi Adelson can be. So much so that she would try to throw her ex-boyfriend under the bus, as well as her own brother, the one who helped pay for the crime. Another indicator of Wendi's potential involvement is that one of the hitmen said, quote, "The lady wants her kids back," end quote. So the hitman knew that Wendi Adelson, if of course they were talking about her, wanted to get her kids back. The hitman saying this makes it clear that the crime was committed for Wendi's benefit. Her wanting her kids back means, I think, that she wanted sole custody, she wanted them full time, and she wanted them with her in Miami. Another potential indicator is the jealousy that Wendi appeared to have against Dan's new girlfriend in New York. Dan was dating Amy Adler, who is a professor at NYU, and she also happens to be designer Jonathan Adler's sister. Wendi couldn't seem to handle the fact that Dan was moving on with a very accomplished and very attractive woman. And Wendi also made it hard for Dan to Skype with their kids. Wendi said, "How do you get two toddlers to focus on a Skype call?" Wendi dumping Jeff Lacasse on the week of the crime makes it seem like Wendi was not planning to stay in Tallahassee, where Jeff lived. Wendi and Dan's sons had actually grown attached to Jeff, and Wendi and Jeff had been dating for quite some time. It's odd that Wendi suddenly broke it all off just a few days before Dan was attacked. And again, right after Dan's death, she immediately moves to South Florida, and she was able to leave within days of Dan's service. It would seem that all of her things and the boys appeared to have been crammed into the Adelsons' cars, makes it seem like the packing might have occurred before the crime. This is me speculating, but we all know how long it takes to pack up an entire house. Again, this might indicate that Wendi knew Dan was going to die. It's also weird that Wendi would not have wanted support from Jeff after Dan's death. If she really cared about Jeff, and if she was really horrified and scared after Dan's death, then you think she would have reached out to her most recent boyfriend. She did not do that. Another potential indicator of Wendi's knowledge of the crime, allegedly, is that she never attempted to stop her mother, Donna, from bad-mouthing Dan in front of their kids. Donna said all sorts of horrible things about Dan in front of the little boys, including saying that their father was stupid, that their father wasn't allowing Grandma, her, Donna, to see her, quote, sunshines. A loving mother and a loving grandmother would not try to poison a father's relationship with his kids. That type of thing hurts not only the spouse, but also the kids. This illustrates an even harder, colder part of Donna and Wendi. The boys reported these insults back to their father, so he was aware that Donna and Wendi seemed to be trying to alienate his children from him. Wendi was well educated. She often portrays herself as a mother who puts her children's well-being first. Well, to allow her mom, Donna, to denigrate Dan in front of those kids, that's not putting the kids' emotional needs first. That's almost as callous to those kids as it was to Dan. Here's another indicator of Wendi's potential guilt. She actually mentioned the subject of accepting death as a part of life to her sons just days before Dan died. The kids at the time were just 3 and 4 years old. That seems a tad early for having such a conversation. Also, what are the odds that you bring up death to your sons just a few days before their father dies? Is that just a coincidence? I don't think so. But that's just my opinion. And when Wendi announced to Dan that she was leaving, that too went down quickly. As I told you, Dan flew home from New York City only to find Wendi and the boys gone. This may indicate Wendi's modus operandi, or MO, which is to strike without warning and then carry out the activity very quickly. Again, this is just an indicator of potential guilt. Wendi wrote and published a book before Dan's unaliving that appears to mirror her life with him. The book references a Chicago play wherein the husband of the wife is unalived. It's eerily similar to what ultimately happened to Dan. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. This doesn't prove Wendi's premeditated knowledge of Dan's death, but it's another little chink in the armor. This goes hand in hand with the fact that Wendi was wearing a t-shirt with an owl on it when she was interviewed after getting news of Dan's unaliving. What are the odds that one of the hitmen, Luis Rivera, posted a photo on his Instagram of an owl that he saw during his and Sigfredo's drive from Miami to Tallahassee to commit the crime? Here's a question for you. Do you believe that Charlie Adelson and his mother Donna would allegedly hire people to unalive Dan without talking to Wendi first? After all, if they loved Wendi and her sons, you'd think they'd want to run the plan by her first and get her approval. They probably wouldn't just do it and then create this tragedy for her children without having her agree that it was the only way to ensure she got full-time custody, was allowed to move to Miami, and would not lose her law license. Having Dan die meant avoiding going to court with him, where he planned to prove that she had hidden marital assets from him and thus had not adhered to the code of ethics lawyers are supposed to uphold. And they have to do that not only in their work, but also in their private lives. If you think about it, the stakes could not have been higher for Wendi. She did not want to lose her career. She did not want to lose her law license. And she wanted her kids with her in Miami. Let's move on now to the day of the crime. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera used a nearly identical car to that of Jeff Lacasse. It was a Prius, I believe. That rental car was a similar color and similar size to Jeff Lacasse's car. Now, if Jeff had not been able to prove that he was out of town when Dan was attacked, this car situation would have been another nail in his coffin. It would have supported him being a potential suspect. The hitman using a nearly identical car to that of Jeff Lacasse, that information would have had to have come from Wendi. Next, we know that on the day of the crime, Wendi drove to the crime scene about 1 hour after Dan was attacked. She was there around noon. That's a highly suspicious move to make on the same day your ex-husband is attacked, and especially when you don't live in that house or that neighborhood anymore. Wendi had her own rental home at the time. Wendi would not have heard back from the hitman at that point because they were trying to get back to South Miami without using their phones. So Wendi may have been frustrated at being out of the loop at this point and perhaps wanted to see for herself what was going on at Dan's house. And remember, a lot of perpetrators return to the scene of their crimes because they want to witness it. They want to see the aftermath. Brian Koberger just happened to be at the crime scene house in Moscow, Idaho, hours after the crime. Just saying. Wendi did not check on Dan, nor did she check on her sons after seeing the police at that house. There were multiple squad cars with flashing lights on at the scene, and there was also crime scene tape. And Wendi would have been able to see Dan's house from her location. If you saw your ex's house, and he was the one who had the children on that day, wouldn't you want to call him to ensure your sons were okay? In court, Wendi said she thought that might have been happening because there was a tree down. Garcia and Rivera were caught on security cameras outside Dan's gym that day. Obviously, they were tracking his movements. The hitmen had been to Tallahassee earlier that summer in June, and they were unable to track Dan down. So it would appear that they wanted to ensure that they knew exactly where he was going to be on the day they attacked him. Otherwise, this could have been another wasted trip to Tallahassee. And of course, Wendi would have been the best source of this info. Next, let's talk about the phone calls. Dan called Wendi at 9:02 a.m. that morning, and she didn't answer. However, she did listen to his voicemail right after he hung up. This seems pretty telling. Wendi then called her brother Charlie at 9:19. Why would she call Charlie after Dan's call? And Wendi and Charlie spoke for 18 minutes. Then, at 11:42 a.m., Wendi finally called Dan back. Of course, she would have not been expecting him to answer if she was in on the crime, because Dan was attacked shortly before 11 a.m., and the injuries to his face and his head were so severe that he never regained consciousness. Note that when Sigfredo Rivera's baby mama, Catherine McBanoa, finally received a call from Sigfredo and Luis that day at around 12:30 or 12:45 p.m., they told her the job was done, and Katie replied, quote, "I know," end quote. So who could have told Katie that the mission had been accomplished? It was most likely Charlie Adelson. Thus, it would seem as though Wendi would have been the one to tell Charlie that the crime had occurred, because Charlie was in South Florida at the time Dan was attacked. The next indicator is that when the cops showed up at the restaurant where Wendi was lunching with friends that day, she didn't freak out. And remember, she'd seen the squad cars near Dan's home earlier. So if she were innocent, you'd think that she'd be like, oh my God, did something happen to my boys or my ex? Wendi did not do that. She was cool as a cucumber, and she didn't ask any questions. This may have been her trying to pretend that she had no knowledge of the crime. She was driven in a police cruiser to the station, so that probably should have sparked some fear and worry and questions in her, but it didn't. Her interview with the detective also shows that she wasn't freaking out. The next indicator of Wendi's potential guilt is that she never called Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, when she heard the news about Dan's injuries, nor did Wendi supply the police with the Markels' phone numbers. It was the police who called the Markels much later in the day. They actually had to track them down, and they looked on Facebook for that information. There are a lot of additional indicators as well. All of these pieces make for a large puzzle, and it's a cohesive puzzle that may just show that Wendi Adelson had foreknowledge of Dan Markel's upcoming death and red rum. Let me know if you want to know more indicators, and I'd be happy to do a part 2. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Bed Crime Stories.